Hey everyone, we're going to do a quick tutorial on fetching data from the Pokemon API, or the Poke API, I guess, using React Query, a really cool library that is great for data fetching in React. It provides so many helpful methods for some like really cool stuff like doing exponential backoff on reloading, and it will refetch data for you when you refocus the app. It's just really cool. It's highly configurable. And I just want to show you how to use it for the first time. Like, we're not going to cover any options or anything. We're just going to set it up and fetch some data with it. So let's get started. And we have here a empty code sandbox. Not totally empty. This is the template for a React app. So this is actually modeled on the Create React App project. And if you want to follow along on your local environment, you could use Create React App or just go to Code Sandbox and create a new React app, and you will be right where I am now. So let's go ahead and get started by importing, or rather adding, the dependencies for React queries. So in Code Sandbox, you just do that on the sidebar here, type those in. And we're also going to use Axios, which is a really cool HTTP client for the browser that just will save us a little time. There's other really good ones, and you could do this with the native fetch browser API. Some people would argue that you should do that, and it's fine. It's not really the point of this tutorial, so we'll just use it to speed things up a little bit. And then once we've added the dependencies, the next step is just to import what we need from them. So in this case, we need an import, which is a named import. That's why we have the brackets here. So import useQuery from React Query. And useQuery is the hook that we're going to use in our component to actually do the data fetching. And then we'll also import Axios from Axios. And that is not a named export. It's just a default export, so no brackets on that one. Once we have everything imported, we can start by using the useQuery hook. And we don't have everything we need to use it yet, but we can kind of just sketch it in here. So what the useQuery hook does is it's a function that you need to call first off, and it takes two arguments. The first one is just a name for the query. So we could call it something like fetch Pokemon. And if you had more than one usage of this, or more than one query, they all have to have unique names so that it can properly cache your result, which is probably one of the biggest advantages of useQuery is its caching power, and it takes care of so much work that is annoying to do for yourself. And caching is cool because it means if someone reloads your app and there's no reason for them to refetch data, it will just grab it from their machine, and it just saves you a lot of overhead on network requests. And then the second required argument of useQuery is an asynchronous JavaScript function, which useQuery will await its resolve. And then when it does resolve, it'll take the return value and provide it to you as a value called data that useQuery returns as part of an object. And useQuery returns a bunch of stuff in that object. Another useful thing is the loading value, and that's just going to help us render the right UI. So like if loading is still true, you can't really render a list of Pokemon yet because there's no data. So it's just helpful to know what the state of the fetch is. Cool. So we don't have an async function to pass in here yet, so let's write one. And in JavaScript, you define an async function like that. Just put the async keyword before function, and then give it a name. We'll call it, let's call it fetch ditto. And we're not going to use any parameters for the function. You often do need to use parameters. Like if, for example, we were writing a component that had a prop for the Pokemon name or the Pokemon API, we probably wouldn't want to write like a different function for every Pokemon. So you would parameterize this with the name of the Pokemon and then construct the request using that parameter. Since we're only fetching one Pokemon today, we don't need any arguments. All we need to do is use the Axios method called get, which will fire off a get request to the URL of our choice. And that URL is provided to us by the Poke API documentation. And we see it's just here's the base route and then Pokemon/ditto. So throw that in there, add the path back in, and then we can just return that. Oh, one more thing. And Axios.get is also an async function. So we need to await that inside of our new async function. Sweet. So now that we have that hooked up, we're actually probably able to fetch data now. So let's check our progress by first adding that function into the hook as that second required parameter I mentioned, and then let's just console log out this data, make sure we're actually getting something. Awesome. Cool. So here is the data. Let's make sure that it looks right. Great. So in the side of this return value, we have everything that we expect. One thing I will say is that we don't really need all of this other response metadata. So maybe it would be better in our fetch ditto function, let's just destructure data out of the response from Axios. And this looks a little nicer. This is just what we care about. And that's a good thing. So now that we have that and we are connecting it into our component with useQuery, let's write some code to make sure that we're not going to be rendering anything unless we have data. So let's say if there is no data yet, let's just return an empty, maybe not empty, let's return a div that just says loading and check that out. Cool. So if you look at the console logs, you'll see this is rendering with undefined at the beginning before data is fetched, and we don't really want to do anything yet. As for why we're getting like multiple fetches, that's something that you can tweak with useQuery. There's a third optional argument, and that is a settings object. So in the settings, you can tell useQuery all kinds of stuff like don't fetch under these circumstances, or don't do fetching on window refocus. There's a lot of different settings, and we're not going to mess with any of them today, but just know that if you're having some weird behavior in your use query, that you have that power to go and set some options on it. And just go to the React Query docs and just search for that. Just search React Query documentation and look up all the options that you have and play around with them. For our case, let's skip that for now and just go and let's just see what we can do with this data now that we have some. We can explore what data we have by looking at this console log. And one thing that kind of jumps out to me is this sprites value here. Sprites we're seeing as an object, and it's a structured object, so it's actually pretty interesting. They have sprites for different like generations of Pokemon, and they have different like the different directions, and they have a shiny version, all kinds of different sprites. Let's just return, or let's just render as an image these 4 values here. So we got back default, back shiny, front default, front shiny. So that should be 4 values. We'll ignore the other ones. Sweet. So in order to do that, we're able to use the data here from our hook just as if it was any other data in React, like a state value or a prop or something. So let's replace this placeholder content in our app. And since the value of sprites is an object and all we care about is these strings here, I think what we could do is maybe do this and say, I want to get the object values from the data, from data, and then data has this key sprites here, which we remember is an object. So object.values is going to take this sprites object and just give us back all of these values here. And that includes these nested objects, which we don't really want. So we'll have to take care of that in a second. But now that this is an array, we can map over it and just pass in each value. And then we'll say, okay, so what we could do is, let's actually make this name a little more descriptive so it's easier to read. So if the sprite if the type of the sprite is a string, and the reason we're doing this is because we only want to display these sprites. We're going to ignore these other ones. If you want to show every single sprite that was in here, you could do some fancy stuff like flatten this nested object and just make it a big array of sprite URLs. That's not really the point of this demo, so we're just going to not do that. And then, so we're saying if the type of sprite is string, then what we want to do is we want to render an image where the source is that sprite value. And then if it's not a string, that means it's probably either null or a nested object. We won't render anything. Let me see where my typo is here. Okay, I don't think I closed this map here. So there you go. So now that I added that missing parentheses, we're all good. And there we go. We got the back versions and the front versions, and that's what we expect. We expect to see four sprites here. And that's pretty cool. Now that's really the basics. The only other thing that might be interesting to look at really quick. Well, yeah, so like one thing that I would be curious about is, does our code still work if we use like a different Pokemon in it? Because like the next step we would probably do is try to parameterize this function. So we could check that and just make sure that, yeah, cool. So we see here that if we do a different URL, we're going to get the sprites for that particular Pokemon. And that's great. That's really good to see. We know that our data is working. We know that it's really fetching it from a server. And that's basically it. That's how React Query works. There's a lot more to it that we could talk about in another video, but I hope this has been an interesting introduction and just to look at like the power of useQuery, because it's a great library. Like I love it. It's my only way that I do data fetching now pretty much. And I hope you like it too. So thanks for watching. Bye.